Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to my channel. My name is Hira Durrani and today in this video we'll be talking about the Jacobean and the Caroline age of the history of English literature. So before Jacobean and Caroline age, we went through the Anglo and the Saxon period, which is also known as Anglo-Saxon period. Apart from that, we continued with another video that was known as the Norman conquest. Apart from that, the third video which I made was on the Renaissance era, also known as Elizabethan era. And then now we are going to start with the Jacobean and the Caroline age. After this video, you people will be seeing a video on the Restoration period and then lastly the 18th century. So let's begin with the Caroline and the Jacobean period. Yeah, so let's begin. So Jacobean and Caroline age is also known as the 17th century, in which non-dramatic literature was introduced. So now 17th century deals with the 1603, also known as 1600s. It leads with the death of the Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth was a virgin queen and she never had children. So King James I became the king till 1603 to 1625, being the king of Scotland. So there he was also known as James VI. He was the relative of Queen Elizabeth, since Queen Elizabeth died as a virgin queen and never married and never had kids. Therefore, this time was ruled by James I. So this age is also known as a Jacobean age. So after 1625, Charles I became the King of England and he was the son of James. Charles ruled for 1625 to 1645. Therefore, the time Charles ruled is known as Caroline Age. So the Latin name of James is Jacobus and Charles' Latin name is Carolus. Drama got a hype in Elizabethan era and it subsequently dropped in Jacobean era. So for 30 to 40 years the influence of drama ended and poetry was still written, and mainly the religious poetry was in the limelight. Poets like John Donne, John Milton, and poems which were only based on religion, because the religious people were getting importance and that was conspicuous. So that it was mainly the time of 17th century, which was known as non-dramatic literature, for example poetry and prose. So after the ruling of James, Charles got hold of the ruling charge, and during this time, taxation was increased due to the war setbacks, and Parliament was against his ruling because he married a Roman Catholic, and Parliament was of Protestants. So therefore, parliamentarians thought of him having a Catholic mindset and belief. उस टाइम पे जो पार्लियामेंट थी वो प्रोटेस्टेंट्स थी और ये जो चार्ल्स है ये कैथोलिक था, लेकिन ये कैथोलिक था बट ये बहुत ओपन माइंड सेट इसका था, मतलब ही वॉज नॉट दैट कंजर्वेटिव, इसमें कोई कंजर्वेटिव अप्रोच नहीं था लाइफ की तरफ से. So then later on Charles got executed because he was too harsh with the Puritans. Puritans मतलब जो religious लोग थे उस time society में. So talking about the literature, the most read author was Francis Bacon. He was born before Shakespeare but didn't get his popularity Elizabethan era. Francis Bacon's uncle was the Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth and never gave Francis Bacon a chance to move ahead in life. But under the King James, he got a rapid popularity and became a Lord Chancellor, also had incorporated science in their writings. Therefore, by this time, he was considered to be the father of empiricism. अच्छा, तो अब empiricism क्या होता है? It is a knowledge based on experience and experimentation, या इसको कह सकते हैं कि experimental science is the paradigm of knowledge, या ऐसी चीज़ जो कि experience और experimentation पे बेस करती हो. और इसके against एक rationalism है, like contrary to empiricism, we have rationalism. So rationalism is when you go and talk about reason and logic rather than experimentations and experience. तो बैक टू द टॉपिक, हम बात कर रहे थे लिटरेचर के ऊपर, और इस टाइम की जैकोबियन एंड कैरोलाइन एज में हमारे पास एक ऑथर है फ्रांसिस बेकन, जिसको पॉपुलैरिटी नहीं मिली एलिज़ाबेथन एरा में, इवन दो ये शेक्सपियर से पहले पैदा हुआ था। तो इसके जो रिलेटिव है एक अंकल, वो प्राइम मिनिस्टर था क्वीन एलिज़ाबेथ का, लेकिन उस टाइम पे देन ही इनकॉर्पोरेटेड साइंस इन हिज राइटिंग, and then he was known to be the father of empiricism, क्योंकि science is mainly defined as similar to experience। तो इस टाइम पे इसने बहुत सारे एसेस लिखे थे, और इसके एसेस बहुत प्राइम इम्पोर्टेंस रखते हैं, and it's pertinent to read his essays. So okay, back to the topic. But in 1620 he got held for a corruption case known as bribery as well. इसको पकड़ लिया था, इसको जेल में डाल दिया था bribery के ऊपर या corruption case के ऊपर। And Francis Bacon always considered Latin language to be of utmost importance, and most of his writings were in English, which was merely a coincidence, and most of his essays were of prime importance. For example, है कुछ इसके essays जैसे कि of studies, of friendship, of truth, of revenge, of death, of simulation and dissimulation, और इस तरह के बहुत सारे एसेस हैं जो कि इस एसे सिर्फ ऑफ से शुरू होते हैं, ऑफ स्टडीज़, ऑफ फ्रेंडशिप, राइट। सो हिज एसेस आर पब्लिश्ड इन 3 volumes, and most of the Latin vocabulary is incorporated in his essays. So in the 17th century, in non-dramatic literature, Francis Bacon is an essential personality. So we are done with Francis Bacon. Let's talk about another author or the writer known as John Donne. He is known for the metaphysical poetry. So John Donne was born in Elizabethan era and got fame in Jacobean era, same like Francis Bacon, but John Donne even published works in Elizabethan era and Jacobean era. He had taken his early education in Oxford and Cambridge University. In his metaphysical poetry, he used to use the concept of conceits. Conceits क्या होते हैं? To compare ordinary things with the unusual objects in the universe or the cosmic objects. इसका मतलब ये है कि जॉन डन अपनी पोइट्री में मेटाफिज़िकल कंसीट्स यूज़ करता था, या मेटाफिज़िकल पोइट्री थी, इसमें कंसीट्स का कॉन्सेप्ट यूज़ करता था। कंसीट्स जो है एक फिगरेटिव डिवाइस है, जिसको कहते हैं कि इसकी मोस्टली पोइट्री में ऐसी इसकी पोइट्री होती थी एज इफ़ हमारा एक घर है और घर में एक बेड है, तो योर बेड और माय बेड वुड बी द सेंटर ऑफ अटेंशन, एंड देन द होल यूनिवर्स revolves around my bed or my home. So सारी दुनिया हमारे जैसे कि अर्थ रिवॉल्व करता है सन के, तो इस तरह हमारे बेड के रिवॉल्व करेगा पूरी दुनिया। The next author we have is Sir Thomas Browne. He got fame in 19th century, and Virginia Woolf wrote 2 poems in his popularity and importance. His followers were like 2 less in quantity. Now talking about Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf was an English writer, and she is considered one of the most important modernist 20th century author and a pioneer in the use of stream of consciousness. Now what is the stream of consciousness? So it's a writing technique, and it refers to a narrative technique where the thoughts and emotions of a narrator or characters are written out in such a way that a reader can track the fluid mental state of these characters. So whenever a character is thinking anything, so the writers put that their thoughts in the writing in such a way that the reader thinks that okay, this is happening in real. The next author we have is the Robert Burton. His work Anatomy of Melancholy, which is a very famous work, but the time of Charles I had a war with parliamentarians. Charles was a Catholic and parliamentarians were Puritan, and people who supported Charles I were known as Cavaliers. So here there were Cavalier poets too, and that was Richard Lovelace, John Suckling, Thomas Carew, and these 3 are the most important Cavalier poets. So Cavalier poets used to write poetry in such a musical way. Their job was only to entertain the audience rather than to educate them. And poets used to stay away from religious poetry like metaphysical poetry or the poetry which John Milton used to do. Cavalier poets used to write about the present life rather than the future. So, Cavalier poets used to follow Ben Jonson, but metaphysical poets used to follow John Donne. Talking about metaphysical poets, so we have a number of lists. The first is John Donne, then we have Andrew Marvell, the third we have George Herbert, the fourth we have Richard Cashcrew, fifth we have Henry Vaughan, and sixth Abraham Cowley. So these are the six most important metaphysical poets. Okay, so the next we have is the George Herbert. Further, he proceeded with the works of metaphysical poetry, and the first we had was John Donne. So he got a second and the utmost importance in metaphysical poetry. The first is John Donne. So George Herbert was fond of religion and used to write about religion too. George Herbert learned from George Donne and Richard Cashcrew. Henry Vaughan learned from George Herbert. They used to write metaphysical poetry. So I have made you people understand about metaphysical poetry, that in metaphysical poetry they used to use the concepts of conceits. Okay, so while talking about religious poetry, so we have the name of John Milton, and Andrew Marvell assisted John Milton when he got blind. So Andrew Marvell supported John Milton's writing in the Restoration period. As Charles and parliamentarians had a rage and conflict, it arose as a civil war, and therefore Charles I got executed. Puritans got hold of the government ruling of England. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan and one of the member of the Parliament. Now this age was known as the Puritan age. It was for the short period of time, and Puritan age is also known as the age of Milton because the most famous poet of this era was John Milton. So John Milton was himself a Puritan, मतलब वो बहुत religious था. John Milton was born when Shakespeare wrote his outclass tragedies in 1608. Milton spent most of his writing learning literature and music, and he studied Greek and Latin and the classical works in Greek and Latin. Milton wrote two important works, mainly L'Allegro and Penseroso. Later on, another famous work of his, namely, is Communes by the request of the magician friend Henry Louis. John Milton went to Italy and met Galileo, and there he got to know about King Charles' execution, and he wrote a pamphlet and attacked people through his writing. Monarch restored, and he was at the verge or the brink of getting blind. So this was the time when problem emerged in his life, and this is the time when he wrote his famous poetry, which is also known as the epic poetry, and he wrote Paradise Lost in 1665. He completed writing it in 1667 and he got it published. Paradise Lost has been written in the blank verse in 1662. After the 4 years of publication of Paradise Lost, people got to know about it. So after Paradise Lost, John Milton wrote another or the extended version of Paradise Lost known as the Paradise Regained. Next author we have is John Bunyan. Was an innate artist, wasn't educated a lot and didn't know Latin. Monarch was restored, and he is the writer of the Civil War. So this is the time of Restoration period, and he used to set up illegal religious meetings. For that purpose, he was arrested and was jailed for 12 years. So in there, he wrote a book, Pilgrim's Progress. In today's work, Pilgrim Progress is one of the most greatest allegorical works. So what do you mean by allegorical? So it is a symbolism, metaphorical or figurative devices used in such a work. So after 6 years of getting released from jail, still his work hadn't been published and was kept safe in a drawer. So Puritan writers known as John Milton or John Bunyan were in great problem when monarch was again restored in 1660. and it was the time of restoration period. King Charles II was brought from France and had given the ruling, because Oliver Cromwell wanted to eliminate or annihilate the concept of monarch, like he wanted to destroy the concept of the monarch. So after the ruling of the Cromwell, his son wasn't intelligent enough to rule England, and therefore King Charles II had to take over the ruling of England, and therefore monarch was again restored. Theatres which ended in the time of Oliver or Puritan again reopened in 1660, and Charles II was art loving and had an insight of literature in France. So John Dryden, a Puritan, but changed his concept for the sake of monarch and performed a comic play known as Marriage a la Mode. So this was all that I could discuss or impart you with information about the history of English literature of the Jacobean and Caroline age. So in the next video we'll be talking about the restoration period and the 18th century. Before that, let me tell you guys that we have discussed the monarch, we have discussed the ruling of James the first, and then Charles the first, who was the son of James, and then we discussed the ruling of Charles the second, who was king in France, but he was brought from France to England to rule over England. And because by the time of Puritan age, Oliver Cromwell had a son, but he was not intelligent enough to rule the England. And then this was all. We have few important writers and works which I have discussed, and we did discuss about Queen Elizabeth's reign as well. So she was a virgin queen, and therefore her ruling charge was then shifted to the James the First. So this was all about the video. Thank you so much, and kindly subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, and share as much as you can. And whatever other videos that are in the row, I would be mentioning it in the description box below, so you can check the description box below. Thank you so much. Till then, Allah Hafiz.